Hello again. Thanks to all who are joining us in this session and for those tuning in through the YouTube live stream. Today's conversation is called A Conversation on Anti-Oppression. What does this look like for Assyrians? It is a virtual roundtable facilitation with panelists Jamie Cernick, Mariam Giwargis, Riva Giwargis, and Walita Cannon. If I do say so myself, these folks are super badass. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to this discussion. So my name is Shirley. My pronouns are she and they. I was born in Basra in so-called Iraq, and I am now situated in Hamilton, Ontario, or that's the settler name. I am situated on the traditional territories of the Erie, the Neutral, the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Mississauga peoples. And these lands are protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. I will be moderating today's webinar and session with my friend and colleague, Nirvana. So Nirvana will introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Nirvana Habash. I use she, her pronouns. I was born in Kirkuk, Iraq, but now I'm based in Washington, D.C., which sits on Anacostan and Piscataway indigenous land. I am one of tonight's event organizers, and I will be supporting by moderating the panel conversation and monitoring the chat boxes for those participating by Zoom and those who are watching live on YouTube. The organizers of this event are Assyrians living in the United States and Canada who saw a need to address the role oppressive structures play in the lives of Assyrians and how we as Assyrians can work to dismantle these systems. Many of us met for the first time to organize this webinar, and for the last 2 months we've worked to produce tonight's session. On behalf of all of the organizers, we look forward to sharing with you and inviting you into this conversation. Now I'd like to ask Mariam Giwargis to do a land acknowledgement.
Thank you. So usually when I do a land acknowledgement, I'm physically in a place, and so I make it a point to research that place. Who used to live there? What happened there? Who lives there now? But we're meeting virtually, and so instead I'd like to invite us to each think about where we live. What is its history? What was it called before? What people or peoples called this place home? Where are they now? It's important to do this because first, when we acknowledge the land we are on, we are in fact acknowledging something very fundamental here. The land we are on is stolen. It was stolen through violence. It is kept through violence. And second, when we acknowledge the land we are on, we are also being asked to think about our privilege. Think about how the land we live on, work on, travel through to build our careers or see the world, and that we benefit from is stolen. And finally, the most important piece then to land acknowledgements is to think about our responsibility to stand with Indigenous peoples and their calls for decolonization wherever we are. So it involves work, it involves action. So to listen and then do the work.
Thank you for that, Mariam. And it's important to consider all of these things even when we are in a virtual space. And also because we are indigenous to our homelands in Iraq, Iran, Syria, and Turkey. So it's important to recognize our spaces here as folks who are in a settler colonial state whose lands belong to indigenous peoples. So I wanted to give a shout out to the folks who were involved in organizing this. As Nirvana said, it took 2 months to kind of go back and forth and get everything organized. And all of these folks were super thoughtful and contributed. And I just want to give them a shout out. So some of the names are Arbella Bichlimun, Neda Baba, Nirvana Habash, Raman Daniel, Raymond Hanano, Samantha Dallo, Jamie Cernick, Mariam Giwargis, Riva Giwargis, myself, and Walita Cannon. And if these folks could also like wave at the video, they will also be the facilitators for the breakout session, which is part 2. this webinar. So just to go over the structure and the framework. So because English is the language that we all are most familiar with, we will be using it throughout the webinar. We will also be using something called the progressive stack with a feminist process. So basically what this is we encourage folks to share the air. So those who have not spoken or had a chance to share their thoughts will be prioritized within this chat and also within the breakout session. So basically how progressive stack works is we prioritize folks who are underrepresented and make sure that they have a chance to speak. So if you identify as a cis man, you will be the last to speak, or or otherwise not called upon at all. So you'll be at the bottom of the stack. We ask that everyone please be respectful of the facilitators, the moderators, folks in the chat. Any inappropriate or problematic comments will not be tolerated and will lead to removal from the session. So the webinar will be divided into two parts. So the first part is a virtual roundtable with the facilitators. This session is being live streamed currently on YouTube and recorded. Please use the chat option on Zoom to participate, share, and ask questions. And YouTube comments will also be moderated, and the same guidelines apply there as well. Part two is the smaller breakout room sessions with the facilitators that were named. This session won't be live streamed or recorded to protect anonymity or any comments or experiences that are shared through this session. In an attempt to kind of make this a safer space, if there's any concerns with the breakout sessions, please feel free to private message the moderators and we'll figure that out as well. And at the end of the breakout session, participants can leave whenever they'd like, though we do encourage you to stay for a central review session with everyone when we come back. So we just wanted to start off with the first activity. So you can either kind of do this on your own in your head, or if you're comfortable, you can kind of put up your fingers or participate with your hands. So I'm just going to be asking a few questions and we can reflect either individually or together. So the first question, have you or your family ever had to change your name to assimilate? Second question, have you ever been told you're too dark or to avoid tanning? Have you ever been called a terrorist or immigrant or told to go back to your homeland? Have you ever had trouble navigating a white space? Have you ever experienced discrimination for speaking another language? Do you have full citizenship status in the country you live in? Have you ever had to worry about your financial security? Do you have dependents, family who are in your care, or family that you are financially responsible for in some capacity? Do you identify as a cis man? Have you ever felt you needed to conform to specific behavior because of your gender or sexual identity? Do you have a visible or an invisible disability? Do you or your family own a home? Did you grow up assuming that you would go to college or university and that your family could enable you to do so? Have you ever had to compromise your identity to feel safer? And do you believe that police would help you in an emergency? So we can keep that to ourselves for now, and it's just like a reflection activity. So thank you for participating. So for the purpose of keeping this webinar kind of an intro level and to provide info to a generic info to audiences, we provided some terms that panelists will speak to and their relationship with these terms personally and as a group, and the way that these terms are connected or intersect. The panelists will be having we're kind of having a conversation and not necessarily will be agreeing on everything together. There is going to be some pushback and poll between the panelists. So it is going to be kind of like a organic conversation. And we do encourage as moderators for the panelists to constantly challenge one another. So I'm not sure if I said it before, but we do encourage video participation, but we also respect anonymity. So if you choose not to be on video and you choose not to share your quote unquote real name, please, we respect that as well. So please feel free to do what's most comfortable for you. Yeah. So now we can jump into the panelists. I just want to say that these are the most badass photos I've ever seen. This is the second time I'm using that word, but I might be biased, but these women have been really great to work with. Riva and Mariam, I've known for a very long time, since 2009. And I'm happy and proud to say that a lot of my principles in politics were shaped by having conversations with them. So I do know them in real life, but Jamie and Walita, I only know virtually, and I've had the pleasure of working with them kind of because of this webinar series and the current conversations that are going on globally and within the Assyrian community. So I'll kind of introduce Jamie and Walita. So Jamie, I met her virtually on Twitter. She was super vocal on supporting Black folks' liberation, and specifically with Black Lives Matter. Jamie is a recent Georgetown law graduate, and she's hoping to write the bar in October. And I know that that was kind of pushed back, but hopefully everything works out in that case. Jamie specializes in fair and affordable housing laws. She's a third-generation Assyrian from Chicago. And fun fact, Jamie has played blackjack in 3 different continents. Walita, I have known since seeing her lead the Black March movements back in 2010, and she was involved in the Chicago chapter of that. Walita became involved in Assyrian activism shortly after the US invasion of Iraq in 2003. She has 2 degrees that she never found useful, and so became a software engineer. She lives in Chicago and organizes with the Democratic Socialists of America.
They're great introductions. So I've lived in Washington, D.C. for 10 years, and for about 8 of those years, I wasn't aware that there was a vibrant, albeit small, Assyrian community here. I met Jamie at my first D.C. Assyrians function, and we became fast friends. And Walita, although too humble to accept it, is sort of a living legend in Washington, D.C. So I definitely look forward to hearing from the 2 of you today, but I'd like to take a minute to introduce Dr. Mariam Giwargis. Mariam is a Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Political Studies and Mama Weequin Center for Indigenous Governance and Community-Based Research at the University of Manitoba. She holds a PhD in political science at the University of Alberta. Her work focuses on race and global Indigenous politics, security, violence and nationalism, and politics of West Asia. Before doing her PhD, she worked as a settlement counselor with Assyrian refugees displaced by the 2003 invasion and occupation of Iraq. She has also been an active member of the Assyrian community in Canada for many years. And finally, I'd like to introduce you to Riva Giwargis. Riva is a PhD candidate in the political science department at McMaster University. She specializes in international relations, drawing on post-colonial and decoloniality theories with a focus on Indigenous politics. Her doctoral research focuses on examining indigeneity in the Middle East, specifically examining the case of the Assyrian people of Iraq. She is herself originally an Assyrian from Inishk and Barwad, in what is modern day considered Iraq, and an immigrant settler in Canada. I had the pleasure of meeting Riva by being very intimidated, watching her debate her way through a fiery conversation at the 2018 policy conference in DC, and I'm thrilled to be able to call both her and Mariam my friends and colleagues today. Before we get started, the organizers of this event are Assyrians living in the US and Canada who saw a need to address the role oppressive structures play in the lives of Assyrians and how we as Assyrians can work to dismantle these systems. Many of us met for the first time to organize this webinar, and for the last 2 months, we've worked to produce tonight's session. On behalf of all of the organizers, we look forward to sharing with you and inviting you into this conversation. As always, with conversations about racial and ethnic equity and oppression, I offer a content warning as we do plan to dive into serious subject matter. So let's go ahead and get started with Riva, Walita, Jamie, and Mariam. And we'll start with the first question. So Riva, this was your idea, so it feels natural to start with you. Why don't you share with us how you define privilege and oppression?
Thank you, Nirvana, and thank you, Shirley. Thanks to everyone else for being here, and thank you to the organizers for helping. While this is something that I was really passionate about, it would not have been possible without everyone else's help here, so I really appreciate that. To discuss oppression and privilege, to me, I think we want to start with the privilege checklist, because that simple activity is one aspect to show how, even though we all identify as Assyrian, we have different things that are indicators of privilege. Something as simple as changing your name to anglicize it is one aspect of colonialism working in the system, where we need our names to fit in with the dominant group and how they can pronounce it. For me specifically, oppression is something that throughout my life is something that I have become more aware of as I become more of myself and the place in and my place in the world, especially through my studies and political activism within the Assyrian community and other spaces. And with taking that into consideration, I do want to state that myself, I am residing on a Anishinaabe territory that is also Mississauga, so the Credit First Nation, Mississauga and Haudenosaunee territory of Indigenous peoples here. So oppression for me has meant recognizing how at times my life trajectory has been determined by outside forces. So this for me as an Assyrian means looking at how outside forces, such as even simply the British from Imperial Iraq, have greatly influenced what is modern day Iraq by simply arbitrarily cutting up this land to construct this state. More so, who I am has been shaped by this oppressive system that seamlessly combines the various oppressive structures that at times work together and at times separately to oppress me as an Assyrian woman who was forcibly removed, dispossessed, and displaced from my ancestral land through my family's relocation. So first my family moved from the north of Enish and they started to reside in Baghdad and for economic prosperity. And then my family moved to Jordan and finally settling in Canada. So collectively, this has resulted in my alienation from my Indigenous lands in ways that are first harmful to me by removing me from my land. But it has also made me implicit by participating in settler colonial violence in Canadian state. So what I mean by this is in some ways, I contribute to the violence that is in Canada of colonialism, where I am a settler colonizer, right? Even though different than Europeans, but we are all implicit in this. So I challenge us all to kind of question and think about what this means for us being in the diaspora, where we are forced to be removed from our land, but then we now come and we reside on a colonial state that has its own tensions with Indigenous peoples. So what I push for us is to ask ourselves, where do we fall in this equation? Are we part of the Canadian or American or whatever state you reside in? Are you part of that system? Or do you see yourself working more with Indigenous peoples of that land and working in solidarity? So for me as well, I guess just one last point here. It's also meant that my oppression has been influenced by the Iraqi state, where Assyrian villages were specifically targeted. So here I'm thinking of Simele, and I know that we recently had the Assyrian genocide events, and it's been really good to highlight those things. But it also means that my family, so specifically the males in my family, were enlisted to fight in wars, and for my family to live through wars that disproportionately affected Assyrians, as we were forced to enlist in the Iraqi army, even though we resisted this narrative of an Iraq as an Arab Muslim state. And that's something that we can maybe draw more in the conversation. What does it mean for us to exist on our Indigenous territories, to exist in the greater location of Iraqi state, and then for us to exist in the diaspora? So those are three things that I'm really interested in discussing in more detail.
Thank you so much, Riva. I think a lot of what you just shared really ties into the work that our other panelists have been doing. So Mariam, I would love to know, So much of your work is on race and colonialism. How do privilege and oppression show themselves in the work that you do?
Thank you. I'm actually gonna a little bit echo here what Riva just said. So for me, oppression, then I always want to emphasize that oppression is a structure. It's not personal achievements or failures, but think of oppression as a barrier, right? And then privileges as being the opposite of that. So all of the definitions you were given before attending here today are definitions of a structure. And all of these structures work together, they intersect in order to oppress us. So for example, I'm going to touch on now colonialism, race, and patriarchy. So think about how our lives as Assyrians were forever changed and shaped because colonial powers decided to divide a region, our homeland, into 4 states and give it to the group they thought would benefit their interests the most, who happened to be the majority. Then think about how our lives, my life, was forever changed and shaped because colonial powers had so many wars in a country where I was already oppressed for being Assyrian. Because they had the blueprint for building a state that oppressed indigenous peoples. That's not to say Iraqi governments can't be held accountable, they should be. But I'm inviting you to really think critically here about the different levels of colonialism that have and continue to shape a region like West Asia and a country like Iraq. So the different levels of colonialisms that shape our lives as Assyrians in the diaspora living on stolen land, like Riva highlighted. So colonial power set up the rules of the game, states and borders, and then suddenly you're running away from violence and you become illegal as refugees in Turkey, like my family. My parents worked in a sweatshop and a factory as illegals. And then you think about how this fits into the global capitalist system. My parents worked with no pay sometimes, with no bathroom breaks, while standing all day. And then we as consumers go out and we buy this stuff. I buy this stuff, even though I know the violence that happens when making it. Then if you think about how colonialism and a global racial hierarchy that structures this, as well as capitalism and patriarchy, think about how these structures intersect in my life when I end up in a place like Canada. Now I'm benefiting from colonialism here. So the stealing of indigenous people's lands here in my new home, where I go to school in safety, go to church in safety, call myself Assyrian in safety, where I get an education and become a doctor. But because of white supremacy that shapes this country, I'm now a brown woman. And that means that all the safeties I enjoy are also intersected by all this incredible violence that I deal with day in and day out living in a white supremacist state. Where, for example, I can be a doctor, but my time in academia is full of feelings of, I don't speak the language right, not English, but navigating this white space where there's a common language, feelings of I don't belong here for the same reason, where what I want to study, or the questions I want to ask, or the powers I want to hold accountable are not part of international relations, where white men always have more objective knowledge than me, even if it's about my life or experiences, and how what I study then is from my perspective or my bias. And so my brown female body has to navigate this privileged space with all of these markers of oppression. And I'll stop there.
Miriam, I think you do a brilliant job tying together these structures and key terms to help us understand how oppression and privilege work in practice in the real world. The example of what you and your parents lived through is relatable to so many Assyrians. Walita, I'd like to bring you in and ask, what are your thoughts on the structures that play the biggest role in our collective oppression?
So Mariam brought up her parents working in a sweatshop. And that happens to Assyrians that immigrate to countries where they have precarious legal status as well. So Assyrians are now a mostly diaspora nation. And in the diaspora, we are mostly immigrants or refugees. We find ourselves figuring out how to survive in countries that are foreign to us, where we have to learn how to live, or foreign to our parents. The main thing that connects us to the other people in our adopted countries is our status as workers, our class position. We are mostly workers. We mostly sell our labor to earn a living in order to survive. We find ourselves struggling in the same ways in that context as other people in the countries that we live in, as other members of the working class. You know, struggle to pay our bills, we struggle to stay housed, we struggle to have access to medical care, legal advice, precarious living and financial situations, mounting debt, can we afford college? But not all Assyrians suffer this. Some Assyrians are very wealthy, and they share commonality with other wealthy people in the host countries that they're in. They don't have these struggles. For them, their wealth is a form of their class privilege. For the rest, the lack of it is their class oppression. Now, we all share a commonality, just regardless of our class position, because we were Assyrian. And oftentimes, nations which are oppressed in the way that Assyrians are oppressed express their liberation through nationalist movements. There's nothing wrong with that. We're not going to have a class war within Assyrians. That would be ridiculous and a waste of time. We're not developed in any way, shape, or form enough to even remotely do something like that or to struggle that way. But we still have these privileges and oppressions even within our own national group. We also see this in Iraq. Assyrians are their own nation, small nation within a group in Iraq, but they joined the Iraqi compatriots, for example, and going on strike during the oil refinery strikes in Kirkuk a few decades ago. So we also struggled as workers alongside other Iraqis when the time called for it. Not all, some Assyrians were members of the owner class, but the majority were not. So they shared an oppression as workers with their fellow employees. Now they shared a special oppression being Assyrian workers, being Christian workers. So they had identities layered on top of also being worker that added layers of oppression. We couldn't do the jobs that everyone else could do. Maybe we couldn't study the same things that other people could study. Our names would give us away as being Christians, so we would be persecuted or oppressed at work by our bosses because of that, probably with little to no recourse. So class is another way in which our privilege and oppression is expressed within our own nation and mostly exterior of it. So as immigrants, like Mariam was saying about our parents, my parents went through something very similar. A lot of people come here. A lot of Assyrians go to host countries and they find hostile host governments, hostile to immigrants. They don't want to house them. They don't want to feed them. And it's not because we're Assyrian or Christian. It's because of our status as immigrants and refugees. And it's because of our status as working immigrants and refugees rather than wealthier ones. I'll also stop there.
I think it's really, first of all, I love that everyone on this panel brings a different specialty to the table. As Shirley mentioned earlier, my specialty is in the law. So a lot of what my work has done has been exploring the intersection between how oppressors use the law to reinforce that oppression and maintain those power structures. And so I think it's really interesting that Walita brings up, the ways in which host countries like the United States or Canada use immigration and refugee laws in a way to oppress Assyrians who come into the country fleeing oppression in Atra. For instance, not just Assyrians, but immigrants in the US are under attack right now from the current president. But this has been the way it's always been under every president. It just seems louder right now. And so, this intersects with immigrants experience in the US and Canada and every other host country in so many ways, in terms of the housing they're able to access, credit, education, public benefits, so on and so forth. I also think it's really interesting the way that we've been talking about oppression as a structure, and I kind of want to highlight how the Assyrian experience in the US, because that's where I'm from, but this applies to pretty much any other Western country, how the Assyrian experience actually differs, because we talk a lot of the time about the things that we share, but in terms of repression, the ways in which our identities intersect, that leads to what sort of power we're able to access. And so even though we can have multiple Assyrians in the US who consider themselves part of that community, based on their other intersecting identities, they have different levels of power. So when I think of oppression, I think of like a ladder, and so your access to power is based on where you are in that ladder. So for someone like myself, I'm a 3rd generation Assyrian. I'm mixed European and Assyrian, and I have a lot of access to educational and class privilege. So I would be higher up on that ladder and have more access to power. But perhaps, you know, a brown Assyrian who just immigrated and doesn't have a lot of class privilege would be lower and have less access to power. And it's intriguing if you go through all those different identities and how they intersect, where we all end up. But at the end of the day, you know, myself and an Assyrian immigrant are still going to be lower on that ladder than perhaps, say, a white billionaire. Will have less power than that person. And at the end of the day, myself and an Assyrian immigrant will still be higher up on that ladder in the United States than a poor Black American whose ancestors were forcibly taken from their homeland and enslaved here. And I see a lot of this in the work that I do as an almost affordable housing attorney. All of my work here is totally based on race. So for instance, I used to volunteer at a tenant rights clinic in law school. And when someone walked through the door for assistance, I could tell pretty much right away, 90% of the time, which neighborhood they lived in the US based on their, lived in DC based on their race, because that's how prevalent segregation is. And so I think framing oppression in that sort of way is kind of like a hierarchy, a system, as we've all been discussing here, is really important for our later conversations in this discussion about how we can overcome those systems of oppression and finally reach liberation. And that's all I have to say on the topic.
To Nirvana, if I can just jump in a little bit, I'd like to add a little bit more, especially being mindful of all our participants, thinking of the way that our identities intersect, like Walita, Mariam, and Jamie have been discussing. I want us also thinking a little bit about oppression through a feminist perspective, where for me, it's been the role to understand my oppression differently than other women, where a lot of times I have to push back against this idea of white liberal understanding of what feminism means that centers the oppression of white women, and then having to center and reclaim that space for myself as Assyrian women, right? Where our struggles differ very vastly from theirs, right? So when we think of oppression and we think of all these different structures that we have to deal with, I think for us as Assyrian women, we have to think about, okay, who's the first person that I'm going to approach this with? Is it within Assyrians in my community? Is it the larger state? Is it the larger communities that I'm a part of? So for me, it's always this negotiation with yourself and with your community. But it's also like, when I think of feminism in this way, I'm always advocating for equal footing for myself, not just with men in this patriarchal world, right? That is sexist. But it's also, I have to fight for myself to be recognized as a person who is worthy despite of my color, because the system is white, supremacist, and colonial. So it's interesting to see how, as Assyrian women, we navigate this space. And again, that's something that I'd love for us to highlight and draw more upon.
Thank you so much, everyone. I really love that you all talked so much about intersectionality. And I just want to make sure that we are shouting out also our fellow Black Assyrians, our fellow trans Assyrians, our fellow non-binary Assyrians. That's something this group has spent a lot of time talking about, making sure that people within the Assyrian community, regardless of the other intersecting identities they hold, feel comfortable, feel welcome. And we hope that we are helping to build a safer space here. So I want to move on and take us to the second question. One of the big reasons we're here is to understand what our role is as Assyrians in the movement for Black liberation specifically. So Jamie, can you walk us through your experiences specifically with the Black Lives Matter movement and how you as an Assyrian woman have worked to center Black solidarity in your work?
Absolutely, that's a great question, and it's one I've been thinking about a lot the past couple months. I guess the short answer to why Black liberation matters to me as an Assyrian is because not standing for another's liberation is antithetical to my existence as an Indigenous Assyrian woman. And I don't know how many people on this group tonight were following what happened a couple of months ago, but myself and a large group of young Assyrian women and queer Assyrians saw the greatest civil rights movement of our generation and the lack of response to that by a lot of community leaders, Assyrian community leaders, and we're pretty upset by that. We thought that we had to speak out because our leaders in our community weren't doing that work. And in some cases, we're actually making really racist and offensive statements. And so if you weren't following that, you might not have been aware of the violence that a lot of us faced, which I thought was really ironic because we were getting it from Assyrian nationalists. And I think that the violence we faced, and when I say that, I mean, the Twitter doxing. So a couple of Assyrian women their personal information was leaked online, photos of where they lived, their work addresses. People were called really horrible, violent names on the internet. Women were silenced at the Assyrian organizations they worked with. I was kicked out, actually, of the Assyrian organization I volunteered with because I was told I had to choose between advocating for Assyrian causes back in Atra or advocating for non-Assyrian causes, which is what the leadership of that organization considered Black Lives Matter. So I think it's just ironic that an Assyrian nationalist, someone who proclaims to love our nation and want to advocate for us, would want to harm other Assyrians. And the reason why that is because anti-Blackness is just so prevalent in our community that folks would rather put down other Assyrians than to stand with the Black community. And so my answer to this question of why as an Assyrian do you care about Black liberation, it's not really addressed to anyone in this chat because I think you are probably here at this panel witnessing it because you agree with us that Black liberation matters. And so my answer to that question would probably be directed at, the Assyrian nationalists and the people who are supposed to be our leaders who wouldn't stand up. And my answer is, I would like people to stop, using their nationalism as an excuse for their racism. As someone whose family immigrated here 100 years ago because of the genocide, that's really offensive to me that someone would use their nationalism as an Assyrian to advance a racist agenda and say, well, why do you care that Black Lives Matter because you're detracting from an Assyrian cause? When at the end of the day, indigenous Assyrians are, the Middle Eastern freedom fighters. We have been fighting oppression for centuries. And I think it's actually dishonoring, my family and my ancestors. And I think it's dishonoring the families of everyone in this video. And I think it's dishonoring their families too, to reduce, our existence to being an insular community that can't care about anyone else. And if you do so, you're harming us. So again, and I think it's offensive also to try to align Assyrians with a white supremacist president in the hopes that he'll throw us a bone and save Assyria somehow. And in return for hoping for that some kind of saving from Trump, you have to go along with his plan and put down, Black Americans and other marginalized people. I think that's feeding into a white supremacist structure. And quite frankly, I think Assyrian leaders and Assyrian nationalists need to stop doing that because it's harming us as well. And that's what I have to say on
that. Jamie makes a great point in that in America, people become white. I was thinking today, if you were to go back to the Ottoman Empire 150 years ago and tell Assyrians they were white, they would look at you like you were crazy. The Irish weren't considered white until they became Copts and became the strong arm law of the white supremacist state, beating Black and brown people. They were then accepted into the white supremacy club. But I also wanted to talk a little bit about, why we care about Black Lives Matter. So this is a question we get a lot. What does Black Lives Matter in America have to do with Assyrians at all? So I kind of want to explain it in a way that maybe ties it up with a nice little bow. So when people are oppressed in any way, in a place that you live, what that tells us about the place that you live is that the state is powerful enough to structurally oppress a group of people, right? And when a state is powerful enough to structurally oppress a group of people, they're eventually going to oppress another group of people, and on and on and on. It doesn't stop. We've all heard that poem, first they came for, and I said nothing, then they came for. I mean, that's how history unfolds. It's how it's happening here in the United States. It was first the Muslim ban, and they went after, actually first the people from Latin America, and then Muslims, and then Black Lives Matter activists. I mean, it keeps going and going and going. And now they're going after Kamala Harris's birthright citizenship, which, because they don't consider her truly American because her parents weren't born citizens. That's me. My parents weren't natural born citizens. So if they make this an issue, my citizenship, despite the fact that being born in Chicago, is now up for grabs by an oppressive state that wants to do away with anybody that is an American in their eyes. So it affects me. I don't necessarily like or care about Kamala Harris. I care about myself. So in order to defend myself, I have to defend her. And I have to defend the right of who really gets to be in this country and who gets to participate in this country. So the liberation of Black people in America means the liberation of people in America, because the liberation of Black people means the structures that are built and designed to oppress have been destroyed. So I want you to think about what true Assyrian liberation would mean in somewhere like Turkey or Iran or Iraq. If Assyrians were truly liberated, they were safe, secure, housed, fed, politically and culturally and linguistically and religiously free, could do what they wanted, it would mean the structures that existed that reinforced the racism, the sectarianism, the cultural and physical genocide against them would be gone. When you look to the most marginalized and oppressed and they realize their freedom, it means everyone has become free. But there is another more tangible material reason. So let's talk about indigenous rights in the US. How is indigenous rights in the US connected to indigenous rights in the Middle East? Well, the indigenous population of the United States specifically, have been organizing for the rights of indigenous nations globally for more than a century at this point. In the 1970s, dozens and dozens of tribes organized themselves and went to Geneva, to the United Nations, to demand a global recognition of indigenous rights and what that means. That ultimately culminated in the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, which we see it as a win for us because we are an indigenous nation. But the country that hosts me, the United States, did not sign on to it, along with a handful of other countries. And they did not sign on to it because signing on to it meant having to do something or recognize their role in what they did to the indigenous people of this land. So me appealing to a government that has no interest in the global rights of indigenous people because it would admit its own wrongdoing of its own genocide on its own land to its own indigenous population means I am hitting my head against a brick wall. It means anything they do for Assyrians or Christians in Iraq is ultimately self-serving because they do not believe in global indigenous rights. They can't believe in global indigenous rights because it would mean that they would have to act for their own indigenous population. And Assyrians will suffer for it. Assyrians will not get the rights and the recognition they need because the United States has its own indigenous problems. So I fight for indigenous liberation in America because I want indigenous liberation for Assyrians in Iraq. I want indigeneity to be an important factor when looking at the future of a people. Looking around you immediately where you live and where you are, and you see the systems of oppression around you, it's not very many points away until it ultimately gets to you in one way or another because of your immigration status, your parents' immigration status that you had nothing to do with, your socioeconomic class, the color of your skin, your sexual identity, your gender identity. I mean, all kinds of things will come into play and eventually it will get to you. So defending the rights of others is ultimately a way to defend the rights for yourself. When everyone else is free, then you can be free. I'll stop there before I go on and on and on.
I'm gonna jump in here, Walita, because I really liked what you had to say there. I think it's so important for me, first I wanted to emphasize how all of these realizations of all the different ways I'm perceived or oppressed or privileged has been and continues to be a journey, right? So where I learn the vocabulary every day through listening and reading, to name the violences and traumas that I've experienced as I process them, sometimes in a moment or sometimes a few days later, sometimes years later. So talking with other oppressed people has helped influence, shape this journey. And it's why I have advocated in the Assyrian community in Canada and pushed them to really see the oppression of other Indigenous peoples and people of color. So I really want to agree with Walita, your point here too. So I see a lot of Assyrians advocating for Indigenous rights, the recognition of Assyrian genocide here in Canada or America, and so on. This is why you can't ask colonial powers that oppress people here, including you, to help liberate us back there, right? So imagine meeting with our prime minister and saying, stop training Kurdish Peshmerga. They help steal our land. They help keep our land. They help displace us. They help occupy us. Think about how that sounds then to ask of a prime minister who has to maintain the colonialism here, where police go into Wet'suwet'en or Mohawk or Six Nations of the Grand River territories to break up camps of protesters. People who are protesting land theft, the very thing you're trying to ask the prime minister to help with. He can't help with Indigenous land claims in Iraq because he has to deal with Indigenous land claims here, right? So this is why, Walita, you said that it would, you know, they'd have to not only deal with it, it would literally unravel this whole state project of Canada, right? You would unravel the whole idea of Iraq and a Kurdistan if they were to recognize that you are Assyrian and that you are Indigenous. That's why it's okay for you to be Christian, Christian Arab, Christian Kurd. It's way harder to deal with you as Assyrian because then you're Indigenous, right? Then you have land claims, then you have self-governance rights, then you have, you know, autonomy like we once did, right? So all of these things come into play there. That's the difference, is why you see this resistance. First, Canada didn't sign on to the UNDRIP either, because they had their own problem of colonialism, right? So this is why solidarity then is so important, because while the differences between different communities are real, we have parallel experiences of oppression based on all these things we've been talking about, right? And there's a reason why it's a cliche to say, you know, there's no justice for any of us without justice for all of us, right? None of us can be free unless we're all free. That's a real thing. And so I think we really need to think about those things when we're thinking about why we should care about Black liberation, because Black liberation is Assyrian liberation. That's why.
I could jump in a little bit here just to kind of echo what everyone has said. And I think for me, one of the many things is questioning how we have benefited for so long in the diaspora from being white passing. But now that we recognize this, we need to ask ourselves, like, what can we do, right? How can we actually help liberate other peoples of colors? And when I think of Black lives, especially in the American context, it allows us to think of whose bodies these are, right? So it allows us to see a racial hierarchy in the States where if we think of Black bodies, if we liberate Black bodies, like everyone is saying, it means liberation for everyone else, right? So I think we really need to think about what we can do to look at those people who are on the margins of the margins. And how do we liberate those people by dismantling this system in order for us to work together and do something more proactive? So I guess that's the question that I'm asking to the panelists as well. How do we, in fact, do this, right? Like, how do we dismantle these systems, and what can we do to liberate Black bodies, which in turn leads to our liberation? But I want to highlight one thing. I think, while I think it's important to say that Black liberation leads to Assyrian liberation, I don't think I want to think of it solely in that way, because when we do that, we make it very Syrian-centric. What I want to do is I want to push back a little bit against that and realize, for me, this is also a humanitarian issue. It's not just a Syrian concern. This is a question about humanity. So if we don't care about Black bodies, but we want people to step in for us. That's saying a lot on how we view other people's bodies. So I think we need to kind of really resist that temptation and think about, what does this mean for humanity, right? If we continue to allow this structure, these structures that are oppressive on Black bodies to exist, and then they harm us as well, what can we do there, right? How can we actually dismantle the system by recognizing how we can actively engage to dismantle them? So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much to all four of the panelists. Those are some great themes in your answers. I think, you know, when we think about the Assyrians and diaspora, there's a lot of disunity at times. And one of my biggest pain points when talking to Assyrians who can't seem to get on board with Black liberation is this inability to understand that Assyrians can take up many causes in the name of liberation. We need to unite for our Assyrian siblings living in Atra and our Black Assyrian siblings living in the diaspora. So on this note of liberation, Lolita, let's move on to our third question and final question, which is, what does liberation look like for you?
I have no idea. No, I'm kidding. It's very hard to conceptualize because we've only ever lived in this world. So it's very hard to conceptualize what liberation actually will look like in practice. But, and some of you know me, for those of you who don't, I'm an active organizer in Chicago with the Democratic Socialists of America. My politics are Marxist. So for me, liberation is class liberation. And with class liberation comes racial liberation, religious liberation, gender and sex liberation. And why do I think that? Well, I'm convinced by it. I'm convinced that class is the identity into which most people belong. Most people are members of the working class, and most people have absolutely no power when they walk into a job. So what do I mean by that? Well, I'll quote a Black Panther, famous Black Panther. Some of you might know him by Stokely Carmichael. His own given name was Kwame Ture, is what he renamed himself. He was a Black Panther, he was a Black liberation activist. He was explicitly anti-capitalist and anti-racist because to him it was the system of capitalism. The fact that we have owners and workers that reinforces and upholds the structures and systems that are explicitly racist or sexist, for example. He put it this way, and content warning for some really racist language, but he said, you know, if a white man wants to lynch me, that's his problem. If a white man has the power to lynch me, that's my problem, right? Racism is not a question of attitude, it's a question of power. Where does racism get its power from? It gets it from capitalism. So if you're anti-racist, whether you know it or not, you must be anti-capitalist. The power for racism, the power for sexism, the power for capitalism it comes from capitalism, and it's not an attitude. So liberation for Assyrians, for people in general, historically, the structures that have brought the most liberation to people in the United States, at least, has been labor power, has been unions. Unions make sure that people have the highest wages, they have a democratic say at work, they cannot be oppressed by their boss, they have democratic rights in their workplace, and not just so-called democratic rights outside in the world that the government grants them. The most immediate thing in front of most people is their job, the place they go to every single day, the place that is responsible for whether it decides whether or not you eat, whether or not you have a house, whether or not you have medical care, at least in the United States. Not all of you have that problem. Whether or not you can get a good education, again, in the United States, not all of you have this problem. But the workplace is the most tyrannous place for most people, especially in places where workers have absolutely no rights, especially in places where Assyrians are immigrants or refugees. And when they walk into a workplace and they have absolutely no rights, especially if their immigration status is precarious and is not rock solid, although that could be taken away depending on who's in charge anyway. So for me, liberation looks like class liberation. For me, liberation, national liberation, can come from class liberation. That's where my context comes from. That's where my organizing background comes from. And that's what I am, you know, I organize out in the world based around class. Among Assyrians, it's not based around class. We don't have that internal struggle. It is based on our national identity. So liberation in the United States means ending the empire. And when we end the empire, we end the tentacles that reach the Middle East. And when we cut off the tentacles that reach the Middle East, we don't have an imperial power arming the Kurds, who then use those weapons to move us off of our lands. We don't have a country that organizes a coup against leaders that want to nationalize oil fields and have all citizens share in the wealth of the country they live in. For me, ending the empire and class liberation is one of the forms that Assyrian liberation can take.
Thank you so much, Walita. Riva, I want to bring you in as well. We've spoken before about how you came into this work in part by facing the systems of oppression that you were dealing with directly. Earlier, you gave an example of how Assyrians anglicize our names in order to assimilate, which I think is funny considering I had to voice note you earlier today, triple checking that I was pronouncing your last name correctly. This is a practice that I wish more people committed to. It's one of the sort of minutia pieces of liberation that actually matters to me. The name that you're given has, you know, roots in our culture and our heritage, and that's important. So I want you to speak to what liberation means to you.
Thanks for that, and thanks for saying it properly. My name is often butchered, my last name especially, not the first. Well, I want to start by saying, Walita, I'm here for this liberation that you envision, right? Like ending this empire, thinking about it, especially when I think of, you know, the facade of liberation in Canada, right? So while I recognize the importance of discursive practices by states, and, you know, we could sit here and argue whether or not discursive practice matters, I think of Trudeau. I don't know if everyone here saw, but maybe the Canadians in the conversation did, where Trudeau was taking a knee at a Black Lives Matter protest. And I just found it really ironic because I'm like, okay, so you're sitting here talking about solidarity with Black lives and Black people, especially those in Canada, but I call bullshit, because what have you really done for these Black bodies in Canada, right? So we have to kind of think about what the states are doing. So for me, when I think of the question of liberation, I just think about living in a world where those who are on the margins and those who are oppressed can live a life where they are not marginalized for all these things that they care about, whether that is their race, class, gender, sexuality, religion, any of these things. Like I think of a world where we can dismantle all these structures that we're discussing, right? Whether it's racism, patriarchy, colonialism, or class, and just thinking about how can we live in a way where everyone is liberated, right? Regardless of all these things. So we kind of have to think about how we could put these into action and policy, not just as acts of solidarity, but actual practice. What does this mean? So for me, it means simply just speaking my language clearly without having to think in English and Assyrian, right? Which unfortunately, this is my reality now because I have been educated in the global West. So it means just allowing people to live freely with all these different things that make us who we are. I'm sure in the questions are going to come up for how do we actually do this in practice. And I know that Mariam can touch on that a little bit more, so I'll stop there.
I just want to jump in based on your Trudeau comment. I want to jump in on more of this, like people
you want to call
who
bullshit
are,
too?
I do want to call bullshit because I'm seeing a lot of people jump onto, I don't want to say the bandwagon. I think a lot of people have been coming into the liberation space due to the George Floyd protests and the civil rights movement that's going on. But I want to be clear about what liberation is not. And liberation is not, to me, maintaining the systems of oppression that we've been discussing during this whole panel discussion, but replacing the people at the top with, you know, diverse actors. So one example I think of when I go on Instagram with the people I follow, liberation to me is not like girl bosses. Like pretty much not everyone, but a lot of people can agree that, you know, the patriarchy is an issue in the workplace. But the answer is not to have more women CEOs. The answer is to tear down the capitalist structure that oppresses the working class so that more people can benefit from their labor. And another example, I guess, that's dedicated to Assyrians, a few weeks or months ago in an Assyrian Facebook group, there was an article posted about an Assyrian billionaire. And half the people in the comments were congratulating the billionaire and saying, oh my gosh, this is awesome for us. And the other half were like, okay, but he's still a billionaire and he didn't earn $1 billion. No one ever earns $1 billion. He exploited his way to $1 billion. And his status as a billionaire is not leading to anybody's liberation. It's definitely not leading to more Assyrian liberation. It just means that he has a lot of wealth. And so I think in these discussions on liberation, what it means to me is, you know, tearing down the empire, as Walita says, and making sure that everyone has a seat at the table and the discussions that ensue from there on out, so that we build a society that works for everyone and not just the people at the top. So Miriam, do you also want to call out the bullshit?
I'm going to step in real quick, but I'm not going to call bullshit.
Go for it.
I like what you said about girl bosses, because I hate that so much. You know, so like, what is that supposed to mean? That a woman CEO can behave differently than a male CEO? That makes absolutely no sense. A CEO is a particular position that has a particular responsibility to produce profit for shareholders, and they have to make decisions that will have that outcome. Being a woman or being a man, you're in competition with other CEOs. You're going to be making the same decisions. I mean, a famous example is Marissa Mayer, the first female. She was lauded as the first woman CEO of a major tech company. Well, the first thing she did was end remote working, which screwed over a lot of people who had children. And then immediately after, built her own private nursery in her office. So she was a girl boss, but she treated her workers just like any other CEO would, because she was looking to cut costs and increase profits and make the company more profitable for shareholders, and keep her job, because they would have replaced her if she hadn't done that. She's constrained by the rules of capitalism. We're all constrained by the rules of capitalism. More women in positions of power simply means they're just going to behave just like the men in power, because they have to produce the same outcomes. Otherwise, they will lose those positions. So just something to think about when we hear things like girl boss, or if only a woman was in charge. There's a lot of asterisks on that.
Except your woman in charge was a war criminal, so no thanks. Sorry, I had to do that. Okay, I'm done. I'm going to go back to what does liberation look like for you. You know, Alita, I like what you started and what everybody has said about class, but I'm going to shift a little bit and say what liberation looks like to me is decolonization. Dismantling all of these structures that we just talked about would come from that. So as you were saying earlier, it's not about changing hearts and minds. No, it's about changing policies that shape our lives. So individual people don't have the power to oppress peoples or governments. It's not about doing a language shift. It's about changing the material conditions of people on the ground, changing the conditions they live in and under, right? And so this includes unlearning the colonial, racist, classist, patriarchal, hetero, and cis-normative way we see the world, the way we understand the world and our place in it, and the way that we live in the world with one another. And so I think that would start with decolonization for me, and I'm gonna stop there.
Wow. Okay. I don't want to stop the conversation, but if we're going to stop it anywhere, I think it should be on decolonization. I want to thank everybody who was on our panel. Walita, Jamie, Mariam, Riva, you four are exceptional people. We're so lucky not only that you are Assyrians and that you share an ethnic and cultural identity with us, but that you willingly share your expertise. Each of you have put years and years into, understanding, learning these terms, and now for you all to be part of the movement to lead us into this path, I think is really special. I'm glad to have met you all. I do want to again encourage everyone to continue thinking about decolonizing. By being here today, you're taking a step toward how to decolonize the way you've been told to think about others and how you've been told to see yourself. So can I do a time check and bring in Shirley so that we can wrap up and go into our breakout sessions and have a more intimate conversation.
Thank you, Nirvana. Thank you to the panelists. Nirvana, just a shout out. Thank you for making waves and kind of leading that conversation. And thank you to Jamie, Mariam, Riva, and Walita for the stellar points. So this basically concludes the first part of the presentation. So the live stream and the recording will stop now. And for folks who registered and who want to continue by kind of reflecting through with the breakout sessions, we will do that now. So for everyone who tuned in through YouTube, thank you so much for tuning in. If you want to get in touch, assyrianconvo@gmail.com, and we'll be sure to connect you with any of the panelists if that's something that you're interested in. So keep on fighting the good fight, and thanks for tuning in. We hope you continue this conversation in the communities in which you are active.